Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we did it. We did it together. We're at the nearing the end of a fantastic conference that we've had so far tonight, and we have saved a great panel for the end here, and it's on sports analytics with Momin, Ghaffar, Alex Kravis, and Matt Manicharian. And the last name, that's what I'm going to get to right now. Matt is going to be the host that's going to be asking the questions here tonight. Trinity College of Arts and Sciences alum of 2008, currently is the Vice President of Football and Research at the Sports Info Solutions. I said the, perhaps could just be Sports Info Solutions without the Matt. My apologies if I'm saying it incorrectly, but I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you and the gang.
All right, thank you. Yeah, Sports Info Solutions, the Sports Info Solutions. We're not going to nitpick here. I'll start off by introducing our two panelists. So first off, we have the head of product, X-Ray for live sports at Amazon Prime Video. That's Alex Kravis. And along with her, we have from Trinity College of Arts and Sciences, as myself, alumnus from 2015 and director of strategic research and development at the Jacksonville Jaguars, Momin Ghaffar. So let's get right into it. Alex and Momin, we're here to talk about sports analytics. So Alex, I'll start you off with a real layup here. Why sports analytics? Why has it been growing so much recently? And I think maybe even more importantly, what are the biggest future opportunities in the sports analytics space?
Yeah, so just for reference, I'm in the space of, bringing this kind of data to enhance the viewing experience for customers. And there's lots of other areas, which I think Momin and I have a nice synergy here. But I think the rise has come from a confluence of both advancements in both tech, in software and in hardware, and increased value on data as a way to drive player performance, and on my end to improve the customer experience. I also think that we're at a point, and this might be overly optimistic, where a big chunk of our audiences grew up playing video games. They grew up on Madden, so the concept of data and overlays on the screen kind of for decision making or for their own enjoyment is not that far off from what a lot of fans are used to. I don't think that there's a big cohort of people who I don't think that, but I think there's we're seeing that trend where we want to invest in that. I think in the future there are generally I think of it as 4 different tracks. You have player and team health and performance. You have things like event arbitration and eventually the automation of calls. Hawkeye for tennis is a good example where that's already happening. I think sports betting is a huge opportunity as that becomes more legal, accessible, approachable. There's an opportunity to get both creative and more accurate with betting lines. And then the fourth is my space, opportunities for fan experience. And even though this is the space I'm in, I think it's one of the hardest to predict because there's endless opportunities. There's VR, there's alternate reality, there's like so much stuff that we could do, especially with investments that are happening, with hardware in the stadium and then also, on our side. So that's how I think about it. But I think it's just going to keep getting even more important, even better and better and more important.
Yeah, you mentioned like Hawkeye and the sort of high fidelity data they're producing, say for MLB, where you're not just getting where the players are, but you're getting where every joint of their body is throughout every play. What you can do with that on your end of things, I'm sure just the possibilities are endless, really, in terms of the experiences you can create around that. Momin, why don't I give you an opportunity to kind of introduce yourself? And then I want to ask you sort of the opposite question. What's with all the pushback to analytics? There's so many reasons, like Alex brought up, why analytics, but why the pushback and how do you respond to that when you hear the pushback?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a heck of a question. Broadly speaking, in my particular role at the Jags, I'm working through that pushback by having the information be as accessible as possible, whether it's data science or analytics efforts, product development or what have you. The truth of the matter is that everyone wants more information, and this analytics movement really isn't anything new. If you can develop something where a coach or a scout or anyone else in the front office is able to sit in their office, look at a a gadget or what have you and come to a conclusion on their own, that is really a big win for analytics as a whole. And so, it's interesting. This question of pushback does, have, some serious weight. What has been interesting for me, having been in the sports industry now, is to see how leadership really kind of approaches data and incorporating that into a framework of decision making. It's less of a scouts versus the quants, right? And it's more of how can we come together and find these points of confluence. And I think a lot of the growth in the space and in sports in general has been because ownership groups typically haven't been born and raised in the sports industry. They're coming from different backgrounds and different industries where it's sort of taken as fact that data and data-driven decision making augment the business. And so if you can kind of work off of that, it creates opportunities. And we're now at the point among NFL teams and a number of sports franchises where not being prepared or not knowing what the competitive advantages are is no longer a good excuse, right? You have to have that edge, and wherever you can find those novel insights or those new technology partners or vendors to bring on board, a lot of teams have wisened up to that.
Yeah, I'd love to. It's really interesting, and I totally agree. Like, data can just help you make better decisions. We do this in any business, with any business problem, right? Like Amazon is really into data-driven decision making. And it's actually funny because in the end, if you think about it, like as humans, we're all just data processors. Like we're always ingesting, processing, using data to make decisions. And now we can just take things that you can't see with the human eye and make just better decisions, keep players more safe. And on my side, it's interesting because when I was first thinking about how to use things like next-gen stats to enhance the product experience, I was like talking to a couple folks, and they were like, we don't want you to tell us what's going to happen. Like, what's the point of watching if you're just going to predict every single thing that's going to happen on the field? And so I think that's a really good area of pushback, right? And I would agree that's not the direction we want to go in. We want to just, on the product side of things, we want to tell better stories about what just happened and why. Like the classic example is, we often have highlights where we show, a drive of 5 yards, you thought the touchdown was supposed to happen, it happened, but actually there's only a 5% chance of that happening because there were 8 defenders in the box. Like, we can explain that was actually really impressive, even though it might not have looked it. So I think there's a way to take data and tell more interesting stories without taking away from like what sports are meant to be, right? Because you don't want this future where everything is predicted, everything is run by machines. It's like, what's the point? But I don't think that's where anyone is trying to go. So if anyone is worried about that, that's not what we're doing.
I think at least we'd be a little bit of a ways off, just because it's one thing to win a chess match against a human. If you're a computer, the human beings that have to play on a football field are much less predictable than pawns and rooks and knights. So there's a whole lot more data that you need to be considering there, at least to even approach that. All right, Momin, you mentioned that you think that there's really a lot of adoption. It sounds like working at an organization that's been sort of tech forward with a modern forward-thinking ownership group has really helped with the adoption and the whole culture of the organization. But I want to know, do you still run into situations where there are members of the organization who are less inclined to trust numbers over, say, their gut? And to what extent do you believe there are aspects of football that you can't model on a spreadsheet? Or is it limitless to where we could have robot play callers?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think so much of where we've gotten is through partnerships with folks like Alex over at Amazon, right? And so we're just scratching the surface on what next-gen stats can do for franchises and building models and predicting player performance, right? But yeah, those pockets of resistance are always going to exist, and I think they're healthy, right? I don't think that the best form is one where you're just constantly being able to run things by people, right? I think a debate is healthy. It helps inform why you feel strongly about things the way you do. And, my approach to pushback or resistance, or, people wanting to trust, quote unquote, the gut over, a metric or something to that effect, is understanding that we've got a lot more common ground than we probably think, right? And by the way, this extends to many facets of life. I think you can find common ground with just about anyone. And it's from there, right, where you're able to start working backwards and realize, all right, so this is where we agree. We agree on, this fundamental truth or fact, but we kind of have varying opinions on something that's a little further out from that fundamental truth. Why is that, right? And I think if you approach these conversations with a sense of humility and, own up to the fact that at times you're going to be wrong. You've been played by the data, right? There's measurement bias galore in what we have available to us. And so if we're willing to learn in the process of educating others, and that's a key, semantic there, right? We'll find that over time, we'll be changing our viewpoints or changing how we're, tailoring analytics or models so that we're ultimately finding that source of truth, right? And I think that's the best way to kind of do this. And this will exist in shades that are slightly different from sport to sport. But I think at the end of the day, this is really what we're all trying to do as an analytics community.
Yeah, you make me think of sort of the running backs don't matter debate that you'll sort of see on Twitter, which really isn't a reality amongst either football old school people or football analytics people, or people that might exist somewhere in between, as is possible, as you point out. But really, I don't think there's one football analyst working for a team that would actually say running backs don't matter. The same way, I don't think that there's a head coach or a GM from the old school that would say running backs are a priority in roster building ahead of quarterbacks, pass rushers, left tackles, and cornerbacks. There's a ton of middle ground there, to your point, in terms of, can we have the nuance? Maybe it doesn't fit in 140 characters or whatever it is to say, running backs are an important part of a football team. However, there might be more talent at that position relative to other positions available, and therefore the difference between different skill levels might not be as much as it was it doesn't fit on Twitter. But I think to your point, there's a ton of overlap in terms of what actual people think when you get away from where you just disagree, which is easy.
Matt, I'll add one more point there, right? And since we're talking about running backs, the position isn't a monolith, right? And if we're really, I think, open-minded with how we're even describing or archetyping particular positions, what I would ask some of the fans in this panel or sitting at home and watching is questioning, is Christian McCaffrey a running back? Is Deebo Samuel a running back? And what does that term really mean in terms of roster construction? I think we're starting to see some, interesting coaches and how they're approaching the position and, creating the right schemes and concepts to ultimately have their players in a position to succeed.
I mean, to your point, I don't think it's a coincidence that basketball probably started their analytics revolution a little bit earlier than football. But just as basketball has gone in more of a positionless direction, I think we could see more of that from football for the exact reasons you're bringing up.
Absolutely.
Okay, Alex, I want to transition back over to the next gen stats, which we kind of brought up before. How do you see that evolving in the coming years? And how do you see Amazon Prime Video sort of competing with traditional media or fitting in with traditional media as things kind of progress into the future?
Yeah, I'm sure Momin has an opinion on this too. Next gen stats keep getting better. We've had a relationship with that team for a number of years. And I think, I know a lot of other sports and stadiums are starting to use like optical sensors, and the NFL, for those who don't know, they have sensors in the shoulder pads and the ball and, receivers across the field that transmit that data. It goes through AWS and then comes to us. But the most interesting part for me, I do think there's a whole interesting like instrumentation problem and innovations that can happen in the stadium, which unlocks like a ton of stuff. But just in terms of what it is today, like I think that the way that new metrics and insights can be derived from just that simple raw data point of like where like I think it's something like 200 data points are created for like every play, or over 200 data points. And so that simple locational data, I mean, you can get, acceleration, velocity, how far somebody went. You can, basically recreate the play virtually if you want, which we do. But I think it's interesting to see how we can derive other things like completion probability, or, touchdown probability. So I think that, you start with the straightforward stuff, which you can use to do all kinds of stuff, like I said, like visualizations, and just for like cool data points, like how fast was that person running? And then, heavily sort of more algorithm driven models that output things that like we don't even know that we want, right? So I think that's where that kind of stuff will start to get more accurate. We'll start to see a lot more metrics, and not just metrics, but insights popping up. And I'm looking forward to seeing where that goes, because I think that's a huge part of how we tell a better story of what's going on in the field. You asked about Amazon. I'm not going to use the word. Well, the other word you used that began with a C, but how we stay relevant, right? Given that we have exclusive rights to Thursday Night Football, I think we'll be doing pretty well on those nights. But in general, one of the main ways that we're able to deliver more for customers than maybe traditional broadcast is on the innovation and interactivity side, which I'm not unbiased. That's what I do, right? But our surface area is also wide when it comes to where and when you can watch, right? We're on phones, tablets, web players, every living room device pretty much. So, we're more nimble in being able to deliver an activity. We're also in more places, and that includes Twitch too, by the way, which is just, off the charts in terms of the kind of interactive experiences you can create, you can support there. But yeah, I think that's a huge part of differentiation, right? Outside of having the exclusive rights, like just the surface area and the ability to innovate so much faster, right? And the way that we're able to deliver those with the infrastructure that we have. So yeah, I think that's going to be kind of how we continue to vie for rights.
Sounds very exciting. Momin, I'll switch back over to you. How have you seen the shift in analytics vary? We should point out that you used to work for an NBA team. So how have you seen the shift in data analytics vary from the NBA versus the NFL? Are there the processes of evaluating talent, maximizing efficiency, the sorts of questions that you're looking into similar, and how do they differ?
Yeah, so what's funny about basketball and football is that the salary cap works way more similarly than it does compared to baseball, right? And so this idea of roster construction is governed by more or less, similar rules, right? Obviously, basketball is more litigious than football, and you've got fewer players on those rosters, so it's slightly different. But I think when we get to the brass tacks of it all and compare the data, the semantic understanding of basketball is probably a little different from football, but the player evaluation, the models themselves are rather similar. And I think part of this is because the vendors in the space and the partners in the space have really advanced the data that's available to teams, right? Whether it's an Amazon or Synergy or Second Spectrum, right? We're at this point now where teams feel like they're swimming in data and they're thirsting for these insights, right? So really, it's a lot more similar than you think.
Very interesting. You say swimming in data, but thirsting for insights. I'm curious what you mean by that, kind of more specifically. Can you elaborate?
Yeah, so in talking about football, right? This next-gen stats, that is absolutely wonderful. And Alex mentioned that there are 200 points captured on any particular play, right? If we're looking at these sort of massive tables or spreadsheets, what sort of signal can we glean from aggregating that data? Does a wide receiver separate better than their closest counterpart in terms of the closest player comparable, right? And so questions like that then become interesting when you're then approaching free agency and you're thinking about, all right, well, we want players, wide receivers in this particular archetype. well, let's just go back to the next gen stats, or let's look at something from PFF and have some sort of consensus around, hey, this player is a target that we want to bring into the fold. And I think all of those side questions that I just now asked, right, are questions that, really kind of evolve from, well, shoot, we have the X and Y coordinates of this particular player over the course of their season for the last few seasons. What more can we be doing with that, right? Beyond just reimagining, the games after they've already been played. And so that's where the work is, right? That's where the rubber meets the road, and trying to find the edge, right? Trying to see who may be undervalued and a really good wide receiver that's separating, that just happens to be, maybe injured or not in the right scheme so that their talents are on full display. And so that's just one example of things, right? And I'm sure there are no shortage of other sorts of, hey, we're drowning in this data, but we're still thirsting for insights in this particular part of the front office.
Yeah, I want to just jump in real quick because I have a former life as an analyst, a financial analyst, and there's a really big difference between data and insights. Data is, like you were saying, Momin, the spreadsheet of all that, just data points, but it doesn't mean anything. Like if you have all that data and you can't turn it into something that results in some action or some knowledge, like you're not doing anything with that data. And that's what we mean by, information overload too sometimes, or data overload. I feel like most organizations who, upgrade their sort of infrastructure to be able to capture and, basically instrument and capture metrics and then store them, often go through a phase where they don't know what to do with that, or it's too much. Like they can no longer dump it in Excel and create a pivot table. It's like, we don't even know how to process all this information, and we don't know what we're looking for to begin with. So that's a problem that exists in the analytics world, regardless of sports. So it's just an interesting problem in general, but yeah, I mean, the great examples, right? Like, okay, data point, this player was on the field at this very specific second, but like, what does that mean? The easiest translation is, they were moving this fast. If we can take all the data points together and look at the timestamps. But things like insights, like you were talking about, looking at actual player performance, what can it tell us about how good is a player with a certain stat that we might not have cared about before? What can that tell us about like how well they'll do in another environment? I think that's really valuable.
So that's interesting, because I was curious if there's like a little bit of a rub between what Momin was saying in terms of, when he starts talking about these things, I get going and I start thinking about like, yes. And then when you start combining the data points together and understanding, how they interact, you can start to learn some really interesting things about football. I wonder though, if we get too caught up in the weeds there, in terms of what you're creating, that's content that's really for the masses, that's really trying to appeal to people. Is there a push and pull in your world between, well, this is really interesting, but maybe it's actually a little bit too interesting, and we need to pull back a little bit?
Yeah, I think that like you're talking about like the ethos, like pushback on data in sports, and like the going against the ethos of sport. I mean, I think part of our problem, and we do experience this, is do we have permission from fans to show them this? And I don't mean like legal permission. I mean, like, do they care about it, and do they care about it enough for us to take up real estate on the screen or their time to show them those insights? And I think that like that's been a little bit of a struggle for us to figure out how to do that. So one of the ways that we've really tried to lean in is through experimentation. Like, we don't know if a customer cares about this, but guess what? We have X-ray, and you can turn it off if you don't love it. Like, we can give it to you, and it's an opt-in experience. And if people are spending time looking at that, or we're getting feedback from, either focus groups or panels or on Twitter, which we monitor, every game, then we'll get signals from them on whether or not it's something they care about. So for us, it's a little bit like we have a surface area with X-ray. where we can experiment a little bit more. And that's where we like use it to get signals on like what do customers care about. And we're not afraid to like, if something doesn't resonate, we're not afraid to like take it away. So that to me is the big thing that you have to do when you don't know the answer, which we often don't. You just have to try.
Yeah, well, I'm certainly cheering for you, because I love seeing more and more of that stuff, and I hope that the other kind of data, the user feedback data that you're getting, comes in and supports that kind of thing. But it seems like we're going in a direction where there might be more options for more different types of people. Like
Oh,
I
yeah.
watch Thursday Night Football through the Scouts feed. I know.
Totally. I mean, a huge thing that we're doing in Prime Video is, this idea, this concept of like, your game, your way. So you can choose what you want, right? And so we're all about giving choice. Like if you want to have a deep stats experience, you can go and like, we have all kinds of stats for you to look at. If you just care about like game leaders, which roughly translates to, like your fantasy roster, you can just have that up, right? If you want to know, if you're a casual fan and you just want to know like, how much do these players, like how tall is that person, right? Like that, it's actually an interesting question that a lot of like very casual people want to know. How big are they? You can look at that. I think that the part of the future, it becomes personalization, which is the step beyond customization. Customization is like, choose what you want. Personalization is like, we know what you want. We are going to show you exactly what you want at exactly the right moment. But that's harder to do. But, you see that, like you guys watch Prime Video or you watch Netflix, not everyone's experience is the same. And that's because we try to get smart about using the metadata we have about our content and the customer behavior data to say, here's what we think you'd like. And I think that's like likely the direction that a lot of X-ray like experiences will go in.
Awesome. All right, I want to get really super useful for all the students for a minute here before we get into the Q&A. So I'll start off with you, Momin. Have you noticed more students coming out of college and applying their data and analytics skills to the sports industry? And what was your pathway to the sports industry, and where are the transferable skills?
Yeah, so what's funny to me is that, and I think I can get some laughs from the crowd. I'm not that much older than a lot of people that I think are tuning in tonight. With that being said, a Duke Sports Business Conference didn't exist when I was an undergrad, right? This sports analytics movement was still very much mystifying, right? And roles and jobs and careers weren't as clearly defined even 5-10 years ago. And so what has been inspiring to me is seeing how coursework in statistics and data science and higher level math classes have really kind of churned out a number of qualified, really big thinking students that have been able to maybe land a job in industries outside of sports, but then ultimately make their way into sports. And so the movement is, I think, alive and well. And events like tonight, I think, are the reason why there's so much rich conversation now occurring as well. The things that we took for granted years ago are now sort of almost analytics consensus among a number of professionals. And so part of that is this, availability of people to be answering questions or proposing new ones. And, there are these public hackathons and big data bowls that a number of students are participating in. And that's really, really cool to see.
And without any Duke Sports Business Conference or anything like that, how did you find your way in?
Yeah, for me, it was, I think, as untraditional a path as anyone else, right? I was a pre-med in undergrad and thought I'd be a doctor, broke my parents' heart and said that, I'm going to pump the brakes on that a little bit. Worked in finance for a couple of years and thought, all right, well, I either have to decide if I'm going to do this whole medicine shindig or try to find a job that I think could be one of the coolest jobs in the world. And that was to work in sports. And so luckily I was able to latch on with the San Antonio Spurs and the transferable skill sets, right? Working in finance with big data and helping a large bulge bracket bank decide, which assets or properties are worth holding on to and growing and which ones are worth selling, right? Kind of then tied in neatly to player evaluation and distilling insights from very large data sets.
Very cool.
I wanna just add to that real quick. Like, I also did not take a traditional path in the vast majority of people I work with at Amazon, product managers, engineers, designers, analysts did not expect to be working in sports. Like you said, Momin, this didn't really exist before. So like right now is a situation where if you have any transferable skills and you have a passion for sports, there is room for you. I would also for anyone here who is maybe not necessarily like mathematically inclined, like I know Momin and I both have that background, which definitely helps. I have product managers who don't have that background, but their work on figuring out how can we take data and insights and make it valuable for customers. And there's not a lot of sort of like what you think the kind of analysis would be for that. That's really more about like working backwards from fans. What do they care about? How can we distill this in a way that makes sense to them? How can we visualize it? How can we design it in a way that's compelling? And that's like actually totally different skill set. So there's lots of ways to be involved in sports in general, but even in sports analytics that might not be there's not a one size fits all here. Like you can have all types of there's all types of backgrounds that kind of apply.
And Alex, that's a great transition into one of our first questions from the chat. What was the jump like from being a financial analyst to switching over into the sports world?
For me?
Yeah.
Well, my path was a little less direct than that. I had the background in finance, and I actually thought I was going to be in the entertainment industry for a long time. I did sort of finance and went to grad school for something called information science, which a lot of you might know about, but I thought I was just going to be a consultant, to be honest. Like when I got out of school, I was like, it'd allow me to travel and it's flexible and whatever. And I ended up landing a job at Amazon. They were first on my alphabetical list of applications, and so they got me first. I did start off as a financial analyst at Amazon as well. But I made the leap over to Prime Video to work on X-ray for movies and TV, which was a kind of a perfect marriage. This is like, I was just really lucky, to be honest, but a perfect marriage of like, metadata and information architecture, which is what my grad degree was in. Obviously my background in finance and analysis and just sort of like business background, like it helped. But I had to learn things like product management, working with engineers. I had to learn that all along the way. And then sports came along about 3 or 4 years ago. And so like, it really was, I didn't make an intentional leap into the space. Amazon is one of those places where there's all these investments going on, concurrently, and you get to just be on that ship. Like I'm really lucky in that way. Now I'm in a position where I'm intentionally choosing to keep doing it, right? But for me, like Momin was saying, it's transferable skills, breaking down problems, being able to analyze data, even kind of in a basic way, being able to communicate clearly with your stakeholders. Like those are all things that are helpful in any job, right? There's so much that is transferable across all kinds of jobs. So, yeah, anyway, that was my path.
Yeah. Momin, I'm curious for you, do you see that any other crucial skills, and this is one of the questions in the chat too, that you would encourage students to develop to make themselves competitive applicants entering the industry?
Absolutely. And Alex hit the nail on the head in a lot of regards. It's more than just being a quant whiz, right? It's having the communication chops to work through audiences that sometimes are absolutely not receptive to what you're, explaining. And so, I think I joke that sometimes this theater class I took in undergrad, an improv class, was the best that I could have taken for my career. Being able to think on your feet is just so valuable, especially as you're trying to, not be discouraged in a meeting that doesn't go as well as you'd like. And so I think, there are things that help, right? The data science coursework is fundamental to being a sports analyst, but, having experience with kooky data sets that have nothing to do with the sports world or what you may be into is valuable, because you're ultimately flexing that creative problem solving muscle as a student, hopefully. And the better you get at that, the better you'll be in being able to jump into these ambiguous business settings, whether it's in sports or other industries, and finding your way through a problem statement and ultimately proposing solutions or answers to questions.
Yeah, I think you hit on a few things that I definitely recommend to people when they ask me what they can do to get into sports analytics. I'm always trying to encourage people to try to learn some form of coding skills, whether it's SQL, R, Python. Just trying to get comfortable with any sort of these coding languages can make you, really bring you into sort of, instead of 100, the resume with the 100 resumes in it, you could just get down to maybe the final 10, just by kind of separating yourself with those skills. The other thing is really understanding sports on a deep level. I don't want people to sleep on that. It's one thing to be a fan and to know, all the stats on the back of the baseball card, but really deeply understanding the game, I think is something that, as all of the data analysts, as that tide rises and people start to equal each other in terms of that sort of way, the differentiation is often how well you really understand the data that you're working with. So that's the other aspect that I'm constantly coming back to. Alex, is there anything on that sort of advice front else that you'd care to mention?
Yeah, I would say that depending on the kind of job you're applying to, so if you're applying to like an actual, data science role, you need to have, there's some specific things you probably need to have. You probably need to know SQL. You probably need to know either R or Python, like you were saying. Cloud computing is now becoming kind of a big deal. I think I don't know, back in the day when I was an undergrad, I don't know if there was a differentiation with this, but like at Amazon, there's a pretty big differentiation between business intelligence and data engineering. So, setting up infrastructure and ingesting and processing data at scale is one skill set. Being able to analyze that data, visualize that data, turn it into insights. That's another skill. Those are two different things. But one thing I would say is, almost every time when I see, job descriptions, and I try to be conscious of this when I'm putting up a job description or when I'm hiring, is, there are always going to be things in the requirements that are actually nice to haves. Don't let necessarily something that says, 8+ years of working in sports analytics, like who has that? I don't even know that Momin and I have that, right? So, I would say be bold, like let people tell you no. And maybe they say yes, because you have transferable skills, like, the sport really well, and everything else can be coached. So that's just one piece of advice I have. I know a lot of people are like, I don't check all the boxes, I'm not even going to try, but I would recommend trying, and you can calibrate, like maybe, yes, you're going after something that is unreasonable, but you're right out of school. Like try going for it,
To Alex's point, it's been our sort of approach in putting out job descriptions where we're very, I think, obtuse about what we're looking for, and it's on purpose, right? We want to be wowed by applications. We certainly are, frothing at the mouth whenever we're, seeing that someone's bringing in a big data skill set and have worked with cloud computing tools and can explain what an EC2 instance is and what have you. But at the same time, for any one, sports analyst job that is posted on an industry job board, there are sometimes 500 to 1,000 applicants, and so it's tough, trying to compare 100 qualified candidates against each other. And so anything that can help you stand out, whether it's a blog or an independent study that you've done, or a GitHub repository that you can link to that shows what Alex is talking about, right? The data infrastructure, the data engineering chops, being reconciled with data analysis and data science. Anything that kind of shows that you're this well-rounded candidate is going to ultimately be a boon to your chances in, landing that coveted job in sports analytics.
Yeah, some really, really just great points there in terms of you miss every shot you don't take, right? Going back to the basketball example. So really apply for that. You have nothing to lose by applying. And also, I think from the end of when you are on the hiring end of things versus being on the job applicant side of things, sometimes you feel like you're being annoying and pestering people. But I think from the hiring side of things, it usually looks like somebody who's being persistent and not somebody who's being annoying. So I'm not trying to encourage you to be annoying, but I will say that if you're kind of on the fence of like, is this too much? It probably isn't. It probably is you putting your best foot forward. And so shoot that shot.
Yeah, use your
Okay.
networks too, by the way. Like if you know somebody or, you heard somebody, I might regret this later, but like, if you if you see me on LinkedIn and you're just like, hey, you're my one person I heard that does this, like, it doesn't hurt. Like there are plenty of people across all kinds of industries right now that are really looking to hire. And, that's another way to stand out. And someone might say like, hey, like this is, you go through a different process or whatever, but I also appreciate that when I hear from someone that, I through some network that if I am familiar with, right? So that for better or worse helps. I know that there's some inequities there. It depends on who you know. Amazon has a very rigorous process for hiring. So I have no doubt that we kind of solve some of those things when we get to the interview stage. But yeah, you build your network, use your network. It's one of the best ways to get in front of people.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with that more, for better or for worse.
Yeah.
Couldn't agree with that more, but you got to bring the skills. Otherwise, it's not going to result in anything. So I think we're out of time right now. So I'll kick it back over to Brian to close out.